Welcome back to Core 52. This is chapter 8, and we're going to continue with some of these historical ideas and connections from the Old Testament to the New Testament and to Jesus. Last chapter we learned about just the kingship in Israel and Saul and David, and today we're going to talk a little bit more about Jesus and David and the connection that they had. 2 Samuel Chapter 7, verse 12 says, "When your days are fulfilled," speaking about David, "and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom." So there's a connection between David and Jesus, a very strong connection indeed. As a matter of fact, in the Gospel of Luke, it's speaking about Jesus now, it says, "And the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David." So David wasn't literally his father. That was many generations ago. But the promise that God was going to raise up a king as an offspring of David is coming true in Jesus. Okay? As a matter of fact, Paul says in 2 Timothy, "Remember Jesus Christ, risen from the dead, the offspring of David." So over and over and over, the New Testament writers reference David when they talk about Jesus because they knew the prophecy, they knew what God had promised through David that ultimately would come about. I think this is one of the things that as we learn more about, remember that they wanted a king. God didn't want to give them an earthly king. He wanted to be their king. And so he gave them a king because they kept asking. They were rejecting him. And that king turned away and didn't listen to God and did his own thing and had his own agenda. And so we come to David and then to Jesus. It says, "The true king of Israel is God. Any vessel who sits on Israel's throne must never usurp Yahweh's role. The very claim to the throne is a dangerous step in the wrong direction. The rightful heir to the throne would be anointed by God without ever asking to be. He would be installed in God's timing rather than through his own campaigning. This is precisely where the kings of past, especially Saul, went wrong. Their attempts to promote and protect themselves destroyed their reigns." Now listen to this paragraph. This is on page 56. "It is in Jesus' self-abnegation that he truly modeled David's heart for God. David was anointed king years before actually sitting on the throne." You know that history of David being anointed king, but it was a long time later before he actually became king. "During those days, he was rejected and maligned, abused, and attacked until Saul's self-destruction inaugurated David's rule over Israel. So too for Jesus. Watch this. Jesus, his suffering was the prelude to his enthronement because he did not assert his rule. That's one of the most confusing things to some people about Jesus, is if Jesus is the Messiah, if he is God's son, then why didn't he just take charge of everything? The early followers, disciples, they felt like Jesus was going to march in and take control of everything. But he never asserted his role like that because he was not wanting to be an earthly king like Israel had clamored for and desired for all those years ago and still were desiring. They wanted him to be an earthly king like that, and he was not going to step into that role, at least not in his timing. He was going to continue to submit to the will of the Father, and suffering was the prelude to his enthronement. Some incredible stuff there about David and then Jesus, and how Jesus was much like David, that David was a shadow of Jesus. Now we talked about Moses being a shadow of Jesus. Now David is a shadow of Jesus. Jesus, the way that he becomes king and the way that he does that through submission and surrender and not through self-promotion. So some of the key points from this chapter are God promised David an heir to sit on the throne forever. Secondly, the New Testament claims that Jesus fulfilled that promise. And thirdly, because Jesus is the king of on David's throne, Christians are citizens of his nation, Israel, ultimately. And so I would just say this about that last point. You and I have a connection to Israel because of Jesus. You and I are connected to Israel. We have been grafted into the family because Jesus sits on David's throne. And ultimately, it's Jesus' throne. So a lot to learn as we look at some of these different characters in the scriptures and how they connect to Jesus, how they foreshadow Jesus, and the roles and the parts that Jesus played. So I hope you'll continue to dig in with us, read some of the extra passages, and then read chapter 9, and I'll see you then.